Let's get yelled at today. Okay, before we get started here, I need to get some things out of the way first. I am not a game critic. I'm just a gamer who likes to talk about games. So, as with everything else, I really encourage you to build your own opinion on The Last of Us Part 2. Also, to get it out of the way, I personally love this game, but that doesn't mean that I don't understand some of the criticisms or don't have any critiques for this game at all. However, to say that the story in this game was lazy is just flat out incorrect. I think you can dislike a direction that something has taken and understand that while it's not for you, that doesn't automatically make it bad. Alright, I'm not here to preach, I just wanted to share my thoughts and talk about my most anticipated game of all time. So, if you're willing, let's talk about it. There's really no way to talk about this game without talking about some major spoilers, so it's really best to experience this directly, as there are going to be some elements that I'm going to talk about that are simply better understood having experienced it and not just viewed from a stream or another review. Of course, I'll try to elaborate as much as I can, but do keep this in mind as you're watching this. Before I really dive in, I need to lay some groundwork on where I stand with The Last of Us Part 1. As naturally, this is where most of the comparisons are going. In the month or so leading up to the launch of The Last of Us 2, I streamed a playthrough of the first in commentary format, pointing out the things that made it my favorite game of all time. Naturally, some of the details of side conversations and the dynamic of Ellie's sense of wonder paired with her forced maturity due to the world they live in, and Joel's hardened exterior was the lightning in a bottle Naughty Dog so expertly delivered. However, to say that the game was so great merely because it was a story about a father and his surrogate daughter kind of misses the point in my opinion. Yes, that developing relationship is what gave us a lot of the magic, but it's the cruel reality of their world and the way they made you connect with characters that had very blurred lines of morality that made that relationship so special in the first place. It wasn't about right and wrong, it was about the emotional weights of survival in that world. Ultimately, the journey is about Ellie. I mean, what can I really say about that game that hasn't already been said? Yet, it's important for me to do so because the themes and the consequences of that game is the entire foundation of Part 2. No, Joel is not the good guy for sacrificing the chance at a vaccine that could save humanity for really his own selfish desires. Sure, we empathize with his dilemma as a broken father who wanted to protect Ellie, but the ending poses the real question. Was it about saving Ellie, or was it about saving himself from that pain again? The ending to Part 1 is so significant because you get context to the way Ellie has actually been caring. Not just about her knowing what her immunity meant, but how she came to know about her immunity in the first place. It's weight and significance that no other character can truly understand. Everyone else has adjusted to the reality of surviving their harsh world, whereas Ellie is driven not by survival itself, but a purpose that goes beyond just herself. Even without the context of what we learned in Part 2, you know Ellie feels that her journey with Joel needed to mean something, and then we get answers to that in Part 2.
That's a lot.
So, let's start with gameplay. Gameplay-wise, the brutality.
Jesus.
Survivalism.
Here we go. Shit.
Oh my god.
Get off of me!
And horror are cranked even further than the first. To me, it's less about this franchise having genre-defining gameplay mechanics. Not to say that it's bad, but they're the right mechanics for the environment and type of game being delivered. a harsh environment where patient, intelligent approaches are more forgiving than full-on stealth or full-on gunplay, sometimes meaning that running away is the intelligent move. They took the stuff that worked well from the first game and amplified those aspects, and the revamped skill tree made a ton of sense. Now, I will say that some aspects weren't as easily identifiable, and I didn't even discover the backwards dive until my second playthrough, and the jump attack from above I found to be a little inconsistent. I personally find that I get more immersion and enjoy the game at a different level when I play on harder difficulties, as it forces me to make better decisions, and the hard reality of that world feels more earned in that playstyle. That's not to say that you can't get a similar immersion on the easier difficulties, especially if you simply don't have the time for that, something else prevents you from doing so, or you just want to enjoy the story. I'm just making it clear where my perspective is coming from. I think my favorite thing about the gameplay was that despite this being a linear story-driven game, it was much less of a single-path hallway shooter than the first was. Yes, you still had the same point of interest to reach, but a lot more thought was put into the level design that made it feel more like jumping from pseudo-sandbox to pseudo-sandbox, allowing for a ton of flexibility in level approaches, which I really appreciated. While I don't like when games make you attack dogs, they were challenging and a good way of forcing you to switch up the playstyle. You couldn't just hide forever. However, you really only deal with that for part of the game, and I wish they balanced that out in the second half when playing as Abby. That decision was odd, especially closer to the end of that arc. Some other things that wore out for me was the enemy NPCs calling out their fallen colleagues' names. I totally get where Naughty Dog was going with that, and it did make fighting more brutal and harsh in the beginning, but after a while I just started tuning it out and even became a little annoying.
Carp. What the?
Deborah!
I get that they want you to feel the consequences of your actions, but there was enough in the script to accomplish that anyways. There are sections in the first one where I think they did it a little bit better, like the cannibal group hunting you after the section in the university, for example. Direct world consequences and blended in natural story and character progression. All in all, I enjoyed the gameplay more than the first, and it made sense to switch up the playstyles between Ellie and Abby. Don't worry, we're gonna get to that in a little bit. Once again, the music and audio design was just absolutely magnificent. I mean, the gameplay, audio, world design by themselves almost locked us in as a great game. The guitar playing took a little while to get used to, but as a player myself, it sounded almost more natural than professional grade music production software. The environment feels alive and dynamic, and it's only amplified once again by masterful composing by Gustavo, and I'm gonna butcher this, Santaolalla and Mac Quayle, the latter of which is responsible for the production of music in Mr. Robot, another fantastic TV show. It's a fantastic dance of serene acoustics from Gustavo and deep, pulsing, almost anxiety-inducing music from Quayle. It's such a cool dynamic between the calm sections of the game and the battle sequences. Immersion is everything to me, and great audio production and music makes it.
Think about what he did. How many people are dead because of him?
Last chance.
I'm not giving up, my friend.
Oh my god. The ambience for what we're playing and experiencing is perfect. Pretty much every single aspect of this game I would say is actually better than the first, which leads me to the final point, the story. I have a lot to get through to articulate properly what I mean by almost every aspect being better than the first, except for the story. First off, I'm not saying that it's worse or better than the first. I think it's probably just as good, but at its core, it's my belief that it can't be better than the first because almost the entire foundation of this game depends solely on the events of the first. Which is funny because if you really immerse yourself in the first one, I think it makes The Last of Us Part 2 a better story, but if you didn't, this story still holds its own. If I didn't just make it clear, I think it's a great story, and a lot of criticism that I've seen and heard, while some of it valid, basically come down to I don't like the direction they took, versus here are specific elements as to why it's a poorly written story. And even some of the examples I have seen about the story conveniently leave out the legitimate context that the game did provide, which brings me back to the point about people not liking the direction. Now, let me elaborate because there are flaws that I do want to talk about. I've always been of the school of thought that Ellie didn't really believe Joel at the end of part 1, so that sets a bit of the tone of my perspective entering this game. An endless conversation can be had about whether or not Joel made the quote-unquote right decision in saving Ellie and therefore sacrificing the cure. The fact of the matter is, Joel did save Ellie and effectively took the potential cure to the virus away from the world. That's a statement of fact, but that's not really the point. It's just the circumstance of the world. The real point of the story, and if you play the Left Behind expansion, it really drives this home, is the emotional weight that it now places on Ellie. We got hints of it throughout the first game. The expansion explains it, and now this game explores the true depths of this weight. Joel wants to save his surrogate daughter at the expense of a cure, while Ellie wants her life and immunity to mean something, potentially even at the expense of her relationship with Joel. It's a dilemma Ellie faces, and to say the game boils down to revenge bad is just short-sighted in my opinion. I think the Girlfriend Reviews channel put it really well when saying that revenge was the plot or the theme, but the story really is more about the effects and consequences of actions. And not just the revenge actions. Think about it, the consequence of Joel lying to Ellie about the Fireflies. The consequence of Ellie discovering the truth to then add on to the already heavy weight of her immunity. The consequence of Joel saving Ellie leading to a justifiable path of revenge from the side of Abby. And speaking of Abby, she too had to deal with the consequences of her actions. The death of every single one of her friends that journeyed with her to Jackson. The consequence of Lev and Yara running away from the scars and then choosing to save Abby. The consequence of Abby wanting to return the favor. The consequence of Joel's death, meaning Ellie's opportunity to forgive him has been taken away. It's a lot of nuance that you don't really have to dig through that much. It's all given to you if you give it the chance. Through Ellie's flashbacks, you get a better understanding of the complicated relationship Joel and Ellie actually had. That final conversation the two of them had reframes almost the entire game, similar to finding out how Ellie discovered her immunity at the end of part 1. It's an additional perspective that forces you to rethink pretty much everything. And then they throw you into Abby's perspective, which most people should have seen coming considering they do it in the opening hour or so of the game. I'm going to be the first to admit, my gut reaction was negative. I wanted nothing to do with Abby, and I straight up put my controller down and stopped playing. Joel dying in the first 2 hours of this game caught me a little by surprise, but it was really the only way to get you as the player immersed into the idea of chasing after the revenge plot. But I realized I wasn't seeking revenge for Ellie. I was seeking revenge for me, the player. That's why it was important to step back. I played this in chunks of 2 hours at a time, and that really allowed me to sink into what I was playing, what I was experiencing, and what the story being told was. Eventually, I grew to like Abby and Lev. I connected with those characters. I myself am personally deathly terrified of heights, so the sequence at the top of the skyscrapers was intense in a way that I think only people that have the same fear connect at an additional layer. And that's when it really hit me. The representation mattered, but was delivered in a way to get you to understand truly how different perspectives just change everything. We get a little bit of that as Ellie and Dina explore the synagogue in Seattle. Your worldview is dependent on your environment and what you've been exposed to. So while Abby and Ellie have quite a few similarities and linked motives, it's that perspective difference that really makes this such a ballsy direction Naughty Dog took. Unfortunately, it's so incredibly difficult to pull this off in the real world, let alone a fictional one. That's to say, I liked Abby's section. It was well written. There was actually a lot of mirroring between her and Joel, but more often than not, I found myself trying to hurry to the next section of the story. And I think this is the one part that a lot of reviews are missing or haven't articulated well enough yet, or that Naughty Dog and the critics that rave about this game don't fully understand about its audience. At the end of the day, while the story was masterful in part 1 and almost as good in part 2, it was never going to be better because the love for it was amplified and linked by the audience's love and loyalty to Joel and Ellie as a duo. To be honest, I don't have the answers to how pacing could have been made better, but jumping back 3 days to replay the same time frame as Abby was very jarring. It's a risky move that can pay off to make players uncomfortable, but the difference between telling a story to a passive audience, like a movie or a book, and doing it through gameplay is that the additional layer of immersion suddenly makes you feel like you're playing against yourself. That's the part that I think is the true root of a lot of the criticism, not so much the direction of the story itself, but without a ton of effort on the player side to step back, the game doesn't really do a whole lot to say, hey, we get that you have your loyalties, but just hear us out for a moment. For that, I can't and don't blame any players that went through this and just didn't connect. That is probably the most valid point. It's still not poorly written because it's actually good, but as a gamer, it's hard to step back. Abby's section was very fun to play as, a much physically stronger character than Ellie, and it's fair to say a little bit more battle-hardened. Sure, Ellie learned a lot about survival through her journey with Joel, but their time in Jackson hasn't been spent conquering others or taking over land. It's been spent defending the community and allowing it to grow. It was protective in nature and welcomed newcomers to their community. It's this reason why Joel softened, and it made sense why he let his guard down. I don't think that was out of place for that character. Over time, his love for Ellie and his love for a community that they could both live in made him soft. Seth said it best in part 1.
I know that you are smarter than this.
Really? Guess what? We're shitty people, Joel. It's been that way for a long time.
No, we are survivors.
This is our chance.
It is over, Tess! Now, we tried. Let's just go home.
I'm not going anywhere. This is my last stop.
What?
Our luck had to run out sooner or later.
Do I believe more time could have been spent grieving Joel? Sure, but again, in the type of world they live in, they needed to get out quick. Abby, on the other hand, lives in a community where there are warring groups fighting for control of land and area in Seattle. It's more deliberate and aggressive, and it's not like you have to dig deep to understand it. It's pretty much given to you directly. Ellie discovering slaughtered WLF soldiers by the Scars, encountering the Scars yourself as they mistake you for a WLF, you basically come to find out that Ellie and Abby have a side fight while the fate of Seattle is being decided. It's a pretty neat way of providing perspective at a high level and developing the world. But then we get back to pacing and loyalty to the original characters. I thought the bloater fight as Ellie in Day 3 was great, but probably the best sequences of gameplay were given to Abby. The hotel building with clickers, shamblers, runners, stalkers combined was such an intense way of forcing you to change your tactics on the fly, which made total sense as far as gameplay progression goes. And the Rat King was such an intense boss fight that had me on the edge of my seat terrified. I died so many times throughout the section. My anxiety was at an all-time high. It was amazing.
This thing's not gonna stop.
But looking back at it, it did make me feel like Ellie got the short end of the stick with those opportunities. Back to the whole loyalty thing. These aren't bad elements or lazy writing. It's good, it made sense, but as a player, it's not exactly what I wanted. I wanted more Ellie. It might sound contradictory to say I still think it's a great game, but say I wanted more Ellie, but it's less about the story and more about my own wants, if that makes sense. I think another difficult part is understanding that this game was not going to be delivered story-wise the same way that the first was. In the first, we have a lot of dynamic conversation between Joel and Ellie, and other side characters that come in and have their own story, but really more amplify the relationship between Joel and Ellie. In this game, because it's a little bit more broken up, you don't get quite the same depth of relationship building that you did in the first, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just handled a little bit differently. In the first game, you really only had Joel and Ellie to worry about. There was no one else. And even when you reach Jackson and you get to the arc between Joel trying to give Ellie to Tommy instead, it's very short-lived, and I can't really say that it's better or worse than any of the relationships established in Part 2. The only major difference is that we know the characters from Part 1 versus the characters in Part 2 that are being introduced, but that isn't really a real criticism in my opinion, so that's why I believe that the relationship with Dina and Jesse are just about equal to any relationships established in Part 1. So here's why I think it makes sense. In the time between the first one and this, about 4 or 5 years have occurred. That means that a lot of time has been spent developing relationships with characters that we haven't seen. As far as the deaths of some of those characters, I also don't really see how it's that much different from Part 1. In Part 1, you meet Henry and Sam, which are technically a direct mirror and imitation of Joel and Ellie, but that story ends horribly, and you only really interact with those characters for a small portion of that game. Jesse's screen time with Ellie and Dina are almost the same amount of time, so I don't really understand how that death is any less ceremonious than Henry and Sam, which is a weird way of describing it anyways. You're talking about a man who had to kill his younger brother and then committed suicide. Without a lot of the events that we then dealt with Dina and then Jesse and Tommy to some extent, you really only get a very simple and straightforward revenge plot for Ellie, which I think maybe would have satisfied more people, but it would have been a much more boring game, to be honest. That's just my opinion. I think this was a ballsy direction to take this game, even though there are some holes here. On the flip side, Abby and her journey resembles a lot closer to Joel and Ellie's from the first. However, the circumstances around Yara and Lev are definitely very, very dark topics and themes that Naughty Dog, I think, does a pretty good job at touching without getting overly polarizing in the terms of militarization of the group of the WLF and some more radical religious type topics from the Scars or the Seraphites. That said, without the dynamic and the differences and the circumstances of a larger community that they both deal with now, you don't get the same type of game, and it's the reason why it goes down the path that it does, where it's no longer a very clear-cut decision to exact your revenge, and it's more about thinking about the circumstances and, again, the consequences of those around them. And once I got the full context of what Ellie was dealing with as you get the final conversation after Ellie chooses not to kill Abby, it made more sense. It was never supposed to be about me, the player, but Ellie and Abby. Getting to that place as a gamer was extremely difficult, but subsequent playthroughs actually make it better knowing all that context. Because it's not about revenge being bad, it's about the consequences of going down that path. It didn't matter if Ellie killed Abby and Lev at the end, she had already lost everything by even going there in the first place, especially after Abby basically let her go twice. The intent doesn't matter, it's the actual effect. She did not actually kill Dina, so it doesn't matter what her face looked like, she let them go. All of this then culminates at the very end, where you discover Abby and Lev effectively taken by slavers, and you discover the true weight of everything and the decision around what got them there in the first place. All the actions that led to that sequence of events, and what turned out to be the most visceral and difficult boss fight I have ever played in any video game. Despite the ending that we received, the message had already been sent and the consequences were already being delivered. It was truly a really dark and powerful moment to play through. But that's just my perspective as a gamer and as a non-critic. I totally get why some people didn't like it, and I do want to make that clear. Just because we may have disagreements here doesn't mean that I believe that you're one of those people spewing their nonsense on Twitter. But if you are, maybe grow up a little bit. It's just a game after all. Otherwise, let me know what you think, and I will catch y'all next time.